Chapter 4. Someone Else's Shoes. Sympathy cannot in any sense be regarded as a selfish principle. Adam Smith, 1759. Empathy may be uniquely well suited for bridging the gap between egoism and altruism, since it has the property of transforming another person's misfortune into one's own feeling of distress. Martin Hoffmann, 1981. Walking into Moscow's State Darwin Museum, the very first display will surprise anyone familiar with the history of evolutionary thought. It's a life-size statue of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the French evolutionist, whose ideas are often contrasted with those of Darwin himself. Lamarck is depicted leaning back in an armchair, with two teenage daughters standing by his side. The daughters look remarkably alike, and also resemble the bust, seen a little farther on, of Nadia Coates, the Russian pioneer of animal studies, whose background I had come to investigate. The resemblance is no coincidence. Coates posed for the sculptor of the statue. Photographs of her intelligent, dark-eyed face are featured in display after display in the museum. She was famous in Russia, and remains so today. Even though we're used to primatological heroes of the female gender, the best known among them have caught our attention by living close to dangerous creatures in the forest, defying the stereotype that only men would be brave enough to do so. Coates was brave too, but instead of lurking in the forest, the danger of her place and time resided in the Kremlin. Stalin, under the dark influence of his protege, the amateur geneticist Trofim Lysenko, had many a brilliant biologist publicly recant their ideas, sent to the gulags, or quietly disappear. Names of the persecuted became unmentionable. Entire research institutes were closed down. Thanks to its secular worldview, evolutionary theory was in favor with the Bolsheviks, except, that is, for the idea of genetic change. Since this is a bit like accepting gravity without its pull, scientists had trouble with the tortuous way communism looked at evolution. Staying out of trouble became a major preoccupation for Coates and her husband Alexander, director of the museum. They hid their most sensitive documents and data among the stuffed animals in the basement, and made sure Lamarck received a prominent place in the museum. His theory, formulated before Darwin's, posited that acquired characteristics, such as the stretching of legs by wading birds or the lengthening of the giraffe's neck, can be passed on to the next generation. No genetic mutations are needed. The Lamarckian facade helped make the museum palatable to the powerful. Coates's isolation in Moscow had its advantages, though. She was oblivious to the doctrinal battles in the West, where scientists were busy closing the book on the animal mind. Acting as a surrogate mother for Yoni, a young chimpanzee, Coates opened her heart and eyes to his every expression of sensitivity and intelligence. Rather than regarding him as a robot, devoid of thoughts and feelings, she saw him as a living being, not all that different from her own little son, Rudy. She documented the development of her two charges in loving detail, being one of the first modern scientists to fully appreciate the emotional life of animals. Coates investigated Yoni's reactions to pictures of chimpanzees and other animals, to furs, and to his own reflection in a mirror. Even though Yoni was still too young to recognize what the mirror showed him, Coates describes how, once he had gotten used to it, he would entertain himself by moving his tongue back and forth, and writhe and rotate it, closely studying its movements in the mirror. Coates reports every aspect of Yoni's emotional development, from joy, jealousy, and guilt to sympathy and protection of loved ones. The following passage relates the extreme concern and compassion Yoni felt for Coates. If I pretend to be crying, close my eyes and weep, Yoni immediately stops his play or any other activities, quickly runs over to me, all excited and shagged, from the most remote places in the house, such as the roof or the ceiling of his cage, from where I could not drive him down despite my persistent calls and entreaties. He hastily runs around me, as if looking for the offender. Looking at my face, he tenderly takes my chin in his palm, lightly touches my face with his finger, as though trying to understand what is happening, and turns around, clenching his toes into firm fists. What better evidence for the power of simian sympathy than the fact that an ape who'd refused to descend from the roof of the house for food that was waved at him would do so instantly upon seeing his mistress in distress. Coates describes how Yoni would look into her eyes when she pretended to cry. The more sorrowful and disconsolate my crying, the warmer his sympathy. When she slapped her hands over her eyes, he tried to pull them away, extending his lips toward her face, looking attentively, slightly groaning and whimpering. She describes similar reactions from Rudy, adding that her son went further than the ape, in that he'd actually cry along with her. Rudy cried even when he'd notice a bandage over the eye of his favorite uncle, or when he'd see the maid grimace while swallowing bitter medicine. The one limitation of Coates's work was that she studied a single chimpanzee, and that he was so young. She never got to see the species' mature psychology and knew nothing about the way chimpanzees live in the wild. A psychologist who studied a single boy of a few years old would similarly be unable to generalize about the human species as a whole. On the other hand, because she was in contact with Yoni every day and collected all possible information about him, Coates was able to see a chimp up close in a way very few people have. She looked into the ape's heart and was impressed by what she saw. Coates included perceptive remarks about human behavior. For instance, when she sought a comparison for the temper tantrums that Yoni threw if he didn't get his way, or was temporarily left alone, Coates saw parallels gazing out the window of her study, which overlooked a morgue. Responding to the loss of a family member, especially in a case of accidental death, people utter heartbreaking cries while bending to the ground, almost under the wheels of the funeral carriage, making fitful, desperate gripping movements with their hands. She went on to comment on the human habit to gesticulate as a way of expressing and alleviating grief, comparing this to Yoni's hand gestures, which she found strikingly similar. Having walked by Coates's original writing desk in the museum, a photograph of her sitting next to her husband, another one in which the American expert of ape psychology, Robert Yerkes, talks with her via an interpreter, and a somber gallery of portraits honoring the many scientists executed under Lysenko and Stalin, I ran into a most unexpected display. Amid photos of Yoni laughing while being tickled and crying when frustrated, and an arrangement of his wooden toys and climbing ropes, stood Yoni himself. He has been preserved in a typical hooting posture, the way chimpanzees look when they are excited about something, such as food or company. The taxidermy is superb, as one would expect, given that it was Alexander Coates's specialty. At first, I found it macabre to see the object of so much of Nadia Coates's love and affection standing there as if still alive. But upon reflection, I concluded that preserving Yoni made sense for a couple as devoted to the traditional ways of natural history museums as the Coatses were. After all, each had given the other a preserved animal as a wedding gift. For them, the best way to honor and commemorate Yoni must have been to make him part of their collection. One of the greatest but least known pioneers of primatology had left us her subject in an active pose, so that his obvious emotionality would catch our eye as it did hers. Sympathy. A monkey or rat reacting to another's pain by stopping the behavior that caused it may simply be turning off unpleasant signals. But self-protective altruism can't explain Yoni's reaction to his surrogate mother. First, because he hadn't caused her distress himself. And second, because he could easily have moved away when he saw her crying from the roof of the house. If self-protection had been his goal, he also should have left her hands where they were when she cried behind them. Clearly, Yoni wasn't just focusing on his own situation. He felt an urge to understand what the matter was with Coates. If Yoni were human, we'd speak of sympathy. Sympathy differs from empathy in that it is proactive. Empathy is the process by which we gather information about someone else. Sympathy, in contrast, reflects concern about the other and a desire to improve the other's situation. American psychologist Lauren Wispey offers the following definition. The definition of sympathy has two parts. First, a heightened awareness of the feelings of the other person, and second, an urge to take whatever actions are necessary to alleviate the other person's plight. Let me illustrate the distinction between sympathy and empathy by revealing something about myself. I have more empathy than sympathy. I'm not sure that this is a generalizable gender difference, but my wife seems to have equal amounts of both.